now that we've taken a look at Walker's speech, let's go ahead and move through it bit by bit, and then I kind of want to move through the rubric itself. All right, so to begin with, let's just start where he starts in the introduction. Well, I think that opener needs a lot more development. It goes by really quickly, and he certainly needs to move slower through that essential definition. If he's talking about oligopolies, we need to hear that definition more tangibly. Maybe give us a pause before it, maybe even signal that you're about to define the key concept. Before we go any further, I just want to make sure that we all understand what oligopolies are. The best definition of oligopolies is, all right, and I'm ready and I know I'm supposed to be listening for that. So I think that introduction is a little bit too truncated. And maybe a quick reference or two as to how oligopolies affect us. Perhaps talking about how we might experience them or come across oligopolies in everyday life. So that introduction, we move straight into the speech content itself. And I do think it would be useful for us to spend a little bit more time in that introduction setting us up for the concept and explaining its relevance. All right, so then we move into point one. Clear structure, right? I certainly know as I'm flowing the speech, I know when he's talking about why oligopolies would form, innovation, market preference, entrance barrier, legal concerns, economies of scale. I can follow along with that. A internal preview wouldn't kill you. So maybe throw that out there just as a, say, well, there's a lot of ways in which they form, and I certainly want to speak to these. These move, and maybe it doesn't even have to be a full internal preview. These move from innovation and market preferences to a couple of others, and certainly I want to talk about economies of scale last. So maybe that's a way of doing an internal preview that signals where we're going, but you don't have to spend a whole bunch of time doing it. All right, so it's very clear structure, and each one of those that he had a good example, but probably each needs a little bit more development. Each one of those, right, so he's got 5 sub-points under his first main point. Each one of those probably needs a little bit more development. And overall, the speech, I forgot the time, about 8 minutes. The speech could probably stand to have a little bit more time devoted to it to allow for this type of explanation. So then we move on into point 2, and many of my comments for point 2 are the same as they are for point 1. Each one of these points probably needs a little bit more development. So when he's talking about firms setting prices or setting quantity, all of those make sense, but we're just moving through them too quickly. And again, I appreciate him for doing the lecture, because this is an issue that we often have in lectures, which is having an idea and then getting a taste of its explanation, but moving through far too quickly. And so I think each one of these needs a little bit more time and attention to make it more of a speech and less of a textbook. Right? If this was a textbook explanation and each one of those were paragraphs or sections of a book, they would make perfect sense. But as they are here in a speech, they need more time and development. So then finally we go on to this third point. And I'm not sure how much that third point actually achieved the objectives that it set out to achieve. So at the end of this, I have a good example of a cartel, but I couldn't really give you 1 or 2 reasons for why a cartel differs from an oligopoly. So again, more time devoted to that, and specifically if you say you want to distinguish between oligopolies and a cartel, OPEC is a good example of a cartel, but then maybe run OPEC through what it would look like if it was an oligopoly. Or take OPEC as a cartel and then take an oligopoly and say, but here's what this oligopoly would look like if it were a cartel. If the point is contrast, and that seems to be the entire nature of that third point, if the point is contrast, give us contrast so that it becomes easier to distinguish between those two. All right, so that's basically the flow. Let's kind of go ahead and move through the evaluation form. So invention, topic, time, and audience. Well, again, he's performing this in a very particular way. And if you were in an economics class and this lecture rolled out about halfway through the quarter, or if you were speaking to a group of economists, this might make sense. But as it stands right now, this is hard, I would say, for a lay audience to quickly hop on and follow along easily with these concepts. So I'm going to position this somewhere in adequate. There's some depth there, but there's not necessarily a whole bunch of breadth. And although he does address good points, I feel as if we have to often play a lot of catch up with what he's talking about. Invention under evidence and explanation. Once again, I would say probably adequate here. He's got good examples, but just everything needs more time and attention and develop more elaboration based on what we were talking about earlier in the video lectures. Also, I would like to hear a little bit more hard evidence and expertise on this. So certainly all his examples are coming from him, and when we come back to style, I think that certainly augments his ethos. But I would like to hear some evidence external to him. What are some of the other experts? What have they said about this? Is there a really good quotation about, one particular type of oligopoly? Some additional hard evidence. How many oligopolies would we say typically exist, and so on and so forth. So some evidence external to him as a speaker. So then we get into arrangement. I would say this is good. I certainly don't have any problems following along with the speech. I do have maybe a few questions. I think perhaps it would be better if the logic behind these main points was a bit more evident. Why these main points and not something else? Under style, here I think this slides down. And again, I think this is an illustration of the standard lecture model. This often goes too jargony. So once again, he doesn't slowly define oligopoly. There's a couple of other key terms that just go undefined. Deadweight loss. I can sort of intuit my way to what that term means, especially within the context of its sentences, but that's brain cycles I got to burn up on figuring that out, and at that point I'm not paying as close of attention to his exact content as I could be. So there's a little bit too jargony. By the same token, even when it's jargony, but it's also a bit maybe too writerly, again, this feels like the performance of a textbook. So in one point, in his 2b, where he's talking about setting quantity as opposed to price, he's got this phrase where he's talking about, well, companies, generally emphasize their profit maximizing function. Okay, that makes sense, and if I'm reading it, profit maximizing function makes sense, but that's not necessarily a term that we would use in everyday discourse. I would like to pay less on this before I seek to maximize my profit maximizing function. Rather, in his discussion of this point, I could hear that being more something like, generally, these companies, like most, want to maximize their profit. That kind of makes sense. That's what they do. Now, that's a heck of a lot longer. There's no doubt about it. But we don't speak in terms of profit maximizing function unless that term has been pretty heavily established, either for the audience, and again, if we're talking for an economics lecture, maybe that's a perfectly fine choice. But for a lay audience, you would probably move it out of that writerly, jargony type phrasing. So those are some challenges under style. Nevertheless, I think he certainly demonstrates a sense of expertise. So as he's walking through this, the language that he's using, these concepts that he's discussing are clearly familiar to him. Just the way in which he performs his comfort with these concepts. He looks very calm, collected, confident in what he's talking about. So it's not necessarily a problem of ethos. Rather, it is a problem of, I would say, a problem of ethos and clarity, being able to take that ethos and still make that information clear to us. And then finally, under memory and delivery, I would say, certainly adequate. Certainly he can slow down on key parts. I don't think he necessarily needs to slow down everything, but there are a couple of key points where we're introducing a concept, or you want to give us more time for that concept to sink in. Those need to be slower, but it's a very conversational tone. He looks very composed, very confident. Those delivery aspects are not an issue here. He's physically calm as well as vocally calm. I envy his lower voice. He has a great tone, a beautiful vocal tone. It'd be a wonderful baritone. But I do think that the performance overall would probably benefit from a bit more vocal variety. So we had that low tone, but the danger is that might sound at various points as low energy. So at least contrast would allow us to explore that a little bit more. But nevertheless, not bad delivery. So that's kind of my sense of this. And again, I thank him for sort of performing that model lecture. because these are the problems that we often have with lectures, is people, you're explaining a concept, but you're not explaining it with a lot of depth, or you're not giving us a lot of time, or there's not a lot of elaboration that allow us multiple ways of understanding that concept. I would contrast this with that Neil deGrasse Tyson clip that you watched. There you have the same mastery of content that I think we see here, but also being able to explain it through various ways and various methods. So with that, that ends our discussion of Walker's informative speech, and in the next one we'll take up the analysis of another informative speech.